Now let me turn to Meera. You are the one who has spent more than 6 years there in two different postings and seen things from inside. Now, after his election at a Thanksgiving rally in Florida, President Trump had claimed that he would be India's best friend White House. But in his 100 days, the US President has not nominated anyone as the next ambassador to India. So does it reflect a deep interest in India? My second question is, if people think a joke, I'm not joking, I really mean it. Should we use these tools? Can a smart, suave, handsome and golf-playing interlocutor capable of cultivating Kushner and Ivanka Trump will boost India-US relations? Do you think the deal-maker billionaire president can do excellent business with the former RSS Pracharak turned Indian Prime Minister, who always stresses the importance of a win-win factor for any deal to succeed? And lastly, Xi Jinping and President of China and Donald Trump, not listening what Donald Trump might have said earlier, seem to get along well. Is there some personal chemistry brewing there? And if that happens, what happens to the US pivot or rebalance in Asia? You can answer any sequence, whatever way you want, and you can add any point you want.
Thank you, Surinder. Your first question, the fact that President Trump has not yet appointed an ambassador to India, does that convey a lack of interest in India? Well, so far he has appointed only 7 ambassadors, 5 political and 2 non-political, and most of them still remain to be confirmed. So I don't think that we have been singled out for special indifference. It is more a factor of the turbulence in the first 100 days of President Trump and his focus on the domestic agenda, as well as international events which have driven his policies on the foreign policy front. So we see that his own White House, as was mentioned by several speakers, has not yet stabilized into a consistent team, and that there are pulls and pressures from different factions who are slugging it out. Once an equilibrium is established, if at all, then perhaps you will have a greater sense of consistency and coherence. Right now, you have different factions. The right-wing nationalists, particularly economic nationalists like Steve Bannon, the realists like McMaster, Tillerson, and Defense Secretary James Mattis, who have to conduct policy, and finally the family, which has been appointed to specific official roles and therefore exerts considerable influence on the president. Should we send a suave, handsome, golf-playing special envoy? Well, we've been sending a number of officials, and I would say they're all reasonably suave, even though they may not play golf and may not be particularly handsome. We sent our national security advisor. Well, they are there in their official capacities, not as photogenic heroes. So we've sent our national security advisor, we've sent our foreign secretary. The national security advisor of the US has visited India, and our contacts are continuing. But an outreach to the family, certainly, I think it's something we should do, just as we should do outreach to all institutions and individuals who help to shape policy in the United States. Your third question was whether, President Xi's importance vis-a-vis North Korea is a signal that, is a signal that Pakistan would also be important to the United States and could, in terms of a political settlement or stabilization of Afghanistan. Well, all I would say is that's been the situation for a long time. The North Korean issue has been leveraged by China to enhance its importance to the United States. Of course, it is the most important relationship as both countries describe it. And one thing the Chinese have been paying a great deal of attention to is what happens when a rising power and an established hegemon, which is declining, what happens if there is a premature conflict between the two. And they've come to the conclusion that the rising hegemon gets curbed or restricted if they try to engage in a premature conflict. So China, I think, would, despite being very assertive in its policies in East Asia, the South China Sea, on territorial issues, would, I think, be cautious about really taking on a conflict with the United States prematurely before they feel they have attained or achieved their ambition to replace the United States as the dominant hegemon in the world. And for China assuring President Trump that their balance of trade will be $350 billion less, well, that's the total, that is the total balance of trade deficit which the United States has with China at present. So I'm not sure whether within 3 months that balance of trade deficit will be rectified or restored to balance. But certainly those words would be welcome to President Trump, who has made protectionism and fair trade a priority in his policies as opposed to free trade, which in a sense is a very different path to what the United States has taken in the past, particularly Republicans. It has upended Republican policy, which has traditionally been to support free trade and has also been more interventionist in terms of military power overseas. Here, President Trump has done a U-turn on the latter, where he has actually deployed military power both in Syria and in Afghanistan, and has threatened that nothing is off the table as far as North Korea is concerned. So concerns about isolationism and the fact that the US might withdraw from Asia, perhaps a bit premature, and we have to see how that policy evolves, because the action in Syria was in response to an event, and I think the president has been cautious about being sucked in to a full-fledged military entanglement in Syria. In Afghanistan, we still haven't seen the contours of a policy. It's in the making, because the team, in the run-up to the election, somehow had not prepared. And now, I think they're in the process of trying to evolve a policy on Afghanistan. Would it mean that the remaining US troops in Afghanistan will stay on for a longer period? Will there be some selective enhancement of that presence without boots on the ground, without combat troops, but for purposes of air power? I think one thing which the National Security Advisor said, and which we agree with entirely, is that you need to build Afghan capacities, including air power, because at the moment the Afghan forces are without air power. As far as the India-US relationship is concerned, and President Modi and Prime Minister Modi and President Trump, would they get on? I think personalities matter at the margin. There are also larger issues which frame relationships between countries and come into play. In this case, I think both personalities have positioned themselves as strong political leaders. President Trump has expressed some appreciation for Mr. Modi's victory in UP, has personally congratulated him. And at one level, you could say, and it has been analyzed as such, that this is a trend of strong political, somewhat right-wing leaders coming to power across the globe. To that extent, there should not be that much ideological differences between the two presidents. And what India is trying to do within a democratic framework, I think, is of interest to the United States. On the H-1B visa front, as of now, there's no new policy. There are guidances which have been issued by customs, by Citizenship and Immigration Services, that the visas will be used for their intention, which is for specialty occupations and not for low-end occupations, and that there will be stricter enforcement to see that these are not misused. At the same time, the President has tasked the Department of State, Justice, and Homeland Security to come up with a new policy which would ensure that H-1B visas are used for specialty occupations and not for low-end occupations. We don't know what that policy is going to be. It could involve enhancing the threshold of wages under H-1B. It could involve doing away with the lottery system. But clearly there is going to be a process of disruption and creative re-engineering of processes for Indian companies, which will be a challenge. I do hope that they use this, as Gurcharan said, to move up the value scale and to do more work offshore in India so that the benefits of that flow to our economy in a more direct way. On the question of whether a balance sheet president can build India-US relations, I think there are many factors which would propel the relationship. Strategic congruences, increasingly on certain issues. There are differences on other issues, but those congruences are there and will be there for the future. The role that the Indian-American community plays, it's 3 million strong, increasingly engaged in public life in the United States. In fact, one of the ambassadors appointed by President Trump is Nikki Haley of Indian origin. And for the first time, I think we have more congressmen and a senator of Indian origin in the Senate. And lastly, there is a bipartisan consensus amongst the Republicans and the Democrats that the relationship with India should be built up and should be taken further, should be advanced, just as successive governments in India have pursued a strong relationship with the United States while keeping our own national interests and different perspectives because of our different levels of economic development in mind. And I see this continuing. It's early days. I don't think we can come to conclusions of indifference, and nor should we sulk.
Okay, thanks a lot.